Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Voldemort really does have a daughter. Her name is Delphi, and the reason many viewers or readers don't know about her lies in her appearance in Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, a sequel play whose events take place after the saga's final book, Epilogue. This sort of fanfic introduced a few controversial characters, but the strangest of them all is Voldemort's daughter. Delphi became the catalyst for the play's main conflict, and she brings with her a host of questions that never get convincing answers. Let's look at them together. Enjoy watching. Number 1. Why did she choose amnesia? At the end of the play, Harry and his adult friends stop Delphi from changing the past. Her plan was extreme: prevent Voldemort from meeting baby Harry so she could save him. After failing, Delphi behaves in an unexpected way. She begs them either to kill her or to erase her memory. Why such an extreme choice? Was her attachment to a father she'd never even seen really so strong that failure felt like the end of everything? And why did she give up so quickly when even escaping from Azkaban is at least possible, allowing her to keep trying to continue the Dark Lord's mission? Number 2. Was there a Hogwarts letter? The books briefly mention an intriguing detail. In one of the castle's towers, there's an old dragon hide-bound book and a faded quill. Whenever a magical child with enough potential is born, the quill records the name in the book. At age 11, they get their Hogwarts letter. This system is nearly flawless. Did Delphi ever receive such a letter? If not, why did the book ignore her? If she did, why didn't she go to school? Number 3. How did she sneak into the school? When Albus and Scorpius first travelled into the past, their plan fell apart. They changed events, but not the way they wanted. They failed to save Cedric and ruined the lives of people around them. Ron and Hermione never married. Albus was sorted into Gryffindor, and the friends drifted apart. Albus sent Delphi an owl, and she simply showed up at Hogwarts. How did she do that? Even Delphi herself remarks it was suspiciously easy. If any random girl can just walk in, what happened to the legendary protection of the castle? Number 4. When was Bellatrix pregnant? This is the most talked about question. Delphi's mother was Bellatrix Lestrange, one of Voldemort's most devoted followers. The timing of her pregnancy is extremely vague. Delphi was born before the Battle of Hogwarts, but there are no exact dates. Most likely it happened somewhere between the events of Order of the Phoenix and Deathly Hallows. That would explain why Bellatrix barely appears in Half-Blood Prince, but it's still odd that no one noticed she was pregnant, and the original books don't mention it at all. Number 5. What were Voldemort's plans for her? Let's be honest, it's unlikely that someone obsessed with immortality and blood purity decided to have a child for the sake of family happiness. What was he planning? Did he see Delphi as an heir or replacement? But that would mean admitting he might lose, which contradicts his fanatical belief in his own invincibility. Maybe he intended to use her as a tool, or was he preparing an equal partner to spread chaos together? In any case, the play doesn't give us an answer. Number 6. Why is Delphi the only child? If we assume Voldemort did want offspring, it would have been logical to have more than one heir. Even real-world monarchs often had multiple children to improve the dynasty's survival chances. Voldemort made 7 horcruxes to secure his immortality, yet when it came to direct offspring, he limited himself to a single daughter. Not very foresighted for a supposedly brilliant Dark Lord. Number 7. What were Delphi's own plans? Delphi sincerely dreamed of bringing her father back, of proving she was worthy to stand by his side. But if she had succeeded in changing the past and saving Voldemort, then what? Would she have become his right hand, planned to lead the movement herself, or even decided to get rid of him and take his place? The play gives us no clear explanation. Number 8. Who raised her? After Voldemort and Bellatrix fell, Delphi was left in the care of Euphemia Roll, a name most wizards would struggle to remember. She wasn't among the notorious lieutenants who led raids or stood at Voldemort's side during the Battle of Hogwarts. She never sat at the great table of Malfoy Manor where the Dark Lord hissed orders. "You, Raoul, come forward," is a sentence that never appears in the books. Why would such an obscure follower be chosen to raise the daughter of the most feared wizard in history? It makes no sense that Voldemort, who trusted no one, would leave his only child in such hands. Even stranger, Delphi never became a figure whispered about among old Death Eaters. If Euphemia's purpose was to prepare her for a dark destiny, why didn't she surround the girl with allies who could teach her? Yaxley could have trained her in curses. Dolohov could have shown her how to kill without hesitation. Instead, Delphi grew up in the shadows, invisible to the very people who might have welcomed her as their princess. She was raised like a secret nobody wanted to claim by a woman who left no mark on history. And that emptiness in her upbringing makes her sudden rise to power feel more like myth than reality. Number 9. Why didn't she find other Death Eaters? Delphi claimed to be the true heir of Voldemort. If so, why did she wander alone? Even after the Dark Lord's fall, there were surviving Death Eaters like Walden McNair, known for his loyalty and violence, or the Carrows who tortured students at Hogwarts. And then there were the Malfoys. Draco once trembled before Voldemort at Malfoy Manor. "My lord," he whispered, terrified, but he obeyed. Even if the family turned away in the end, the promise of a restored order could have tempted them back. Yet Delphi never tried. She didn't even send a letter or deliver a threat. Instead, she chose to fool a lonely old man, Amos Diggory, and lure 2 schoolboys into her plan. No armies, no alliances, just fragile lies. It's unconvincing for someone who idolized her father, a man who built an entire following on fear and charisma. Voldemort commanded giants and werewolves. Delphi couldn't gather a single wizard. Her plan fell apart because she ignored what made her father strong, and the story never explains why the daughter of the Dark Lord settled for such a small, pathetic rebellion. Number 10. Where did she get such powerful magic? Delphi could fly without a broom. That alone should have raised every eyebrow in the wizarding world. In the Deathly Hallows, when Voldemort soared above Hogwarts like a shadow, even Harry thought he was flying unsupported. No other wizard in the series performed that feat except Severus Snape, and he learned it after decades of mastering the dark arts. Yet Delphi, hidden away from any formal instruction, simply does it. No training montage, no explanation, just raw, unearned skill. Magic in these stories always came with discipline. Dumbledore practiced for over a century. Even Bellatrix trained under Voldemort for years to reach her level. Delphi was raised by Euphemia Rawle, a minor Death Eater without a reputation for brilliance. So where did she learn the art of wandless levitation, or the kind of spells that could overpower trained auras? The play gives no teacher, no secret library, no cursed relic, whispering lessons in her sleep. It simply expects us to believe that power sprouted in her like a weed, needing neither time nor nurture to grow. Number 11. How did she know about the Time Turners? The Time Turner was no ordinary trinket tucked into a dusty shelf. After the chaos it caused in The Prisoner of Azkaban, the Ministry declared every Time Turner too dangerous to exist. In Order of the Phoenix, the entire stock was destroyed during the battle in the Department of Mysteries. Hermione herself once said, "Professor McGonagall told me that Time Turners are kept under the strictest security." Yet Delphi somehow knew not only that one survived, but exactly where it was hidden. She mapped her entire scheme around this knowledge as if it were common gossip instead of one of the Ministry's deepest secrets. It's never explained how she learned these details. Delphi grew up far from the corridors of power, raised by a single Death Eater in hiding. She wasn't educated in Hogwarts, nor did she have connections to the Department of Mysteries. Even Bellatrix Lestrange, her own mother, never had access to those records. And yet Delphi could recite the time-turner's location as if she'd read the minister's private correspondence. She didn't just steal it, she planned every step in advance, right down to the perfect moment to break into Hermione's office. That level of intelligence work requires inside help, or a narrative shortcut that ignores logic. If she had an informant, the play never reveals who. If she pieced it together alone, no one shows how. The Ministry survived Voldemort because it learned to guard its secrets. But Delphi, a witch no one had heard of, cracked them without leaving a single trace. She knew what entire generations of dark wizards failed to discover, and the story never stops to ask how. Number 12. Why didn't the Ministry notice her activity? Hermione Granger spent her life fighting dark forces. She was the witch who brewed Polyjuice Potion in her second year, the one who helped destroy horcruxes. She once told Harry, "We have to plan, we can't just rush in." In The Cursed Child, she becomes Minister for Magic. No one knew more about vigilance than Hermione, and yet somehow, under her leadership, the Ministry missed every clue about Delphi. No surveillance detected a witch hunting time-turners or forging documents. No aura ever heard a whisper of Voldemort's hidden daughter preparing to rewrite history itself. The inconsistency is hard to ignore. During the Second Wizarding War, the Ministry tracked every wand movement, every suspicious transaction, every unexplained disappearance. Even after the war, they remained cautious. Kingsley Shacklebolt once insisted that vigilance was the price of peace. But Delphi operated for years, gathering knowledge and allies. She penetrated the most secure archives and retrieved the last surviving time-turner. Nobody raised an alarm. Nobody thought to question her visits to St. Oswald's home or her interest in the Diggory family. The Ministry that once catalogued every Death Eater now failed to notice the most dangerous descendant of all. It would have taken only a single Ministry inquiry, a single file cross-checked against records of Bellatrix Lestrange, to raise suspicion. But the story expects us to believe the government built by survivors like Hermione forgot the lessons of Voldemort's reign. They let Delphi grow in the shadows. They left the wizarding world exposed to the same darkness it fought so hard to defeat. Number 13. How did she plan to live in the changed timeline? Delphi never explained how she intended to survive in the world she wanted to create. Her entire scheme hinged on pulling Voldemort back from defeat, rewriting the end of the Battle of Hogwarts. But she never asked the simplest question: what happens when he sees her? Voldemort trusted almost no one. Even Bellatrix, the woman who bore Delphi, was only a useful weapon to him. In the Deathly Hallows, he snarled, "You have disappointed me," when Lucius Malfoy failed him. If he treated old allies with contempt, how would he welcome an unknown witch claiming to be his grown daughter? Imagine Delphi stepping into the Great Hall, the air thick with smoke and shattered stone. Voldemort standing over the body of Harry Potter. She would approach him, heart-hammering, and he would narrow his red eyes. "Who are you?" he would hiss, his voice colder than any curse. She would try to explain, but what story could convince him that she came from the future to help him, that she was proof of his own mortality? Voldemort's mind was a fortress. He would suspect treachery in every word. He might even believe she was a creation of Dumbledore or the Ministry, a last desperate illusion sent to distract him. Delphi never accounted for this suspicion. She believed somehow that Voldemort would embrace her, that he would see her as his heir, not as an inconvenience or a threat. But this was the same man who murdered Bertha Jorkins the instant she became unnecessary, the same man who turned on Severus Snape in the Shrieking Shack without a second thought. He valued no bonds, no loyalty, no family. Even his horcruxes were not born of love but of fear. Delphi's entire plan depended on the fantasy that he would set aside all that history for her sake. If she succeeded, she would have found herself standing beside a monster who never wanted a child, a tyrant who saw attachment as weakness, a dark lord whose only ambition was his own power. She could never be certain whether he would accept her or kill her on the spot. And that is the flaw at the heart of her story. Delphi never prepared for the reality that her father might look into her eyes and see nothing worth saving. Number 14. Why didn't she try to find the horcruxes? Delphi never tried to locate the scattered horcruxes. Not once does the play mention her wondering if they were truly destroyed. It's odd when you remember how obsessed Voldemort was with them. "I have gone further than anybody along the path that leads to immortality," he once boasted in The Half-Blood Prince. Every piece mattered to him. Each horcrux was a secret insurance policy crafted with meticulous cruelty. Yet Delphi, his only daughter, apparently felt no curiosity about these artifacts. She never considered that fragments of her father's soul could still linger somewhere, waiting to be reclaimed. Imagine Delphi sifting through the ruins of the gaunt shack or searching the charred remains of the old orphanage where Tom Riddle grew up. It would have been a chilling scene, her wand light sweeping over the cracked walls. Even if she believed Harry Potter's story that all horcruxes were destroyed, wouldn't she at least have looked for confirmation? Regulus Black gave his life just to steal the locket. Dumbledore's burned hand was a constant reminder that destroying horcruxes came with a price. Delphi, with her supposed devotion, never risks anything to learn the truth. Instead, she simply accepts that her father must return whole, as if resurrection were no more complicated than flicking a wand. She never consults any of Voldemort's old followers like Travers or Rule, who might have remembered where the Dark Lord kept his secret trophies. Not once does she scour the Forbidden Forest where Voldemort hid before his rebirth. She never questions whether any trace of the diary, the ring, or Nagini's remains could still be harnessed. Her inaction betrays a hollow ambition, a kind of childish fantasy, rather than the methodical cunning her father was known for. The story loses weight because Delphi's mission ignores the one thing that made Voldemort terrifying, his relentless quest for immortality. In the Goblet of Fire, he declared, "I was ripped from my body less than spirit, less than the meanest ghost." Those words should have haunted Delphi. They should have driven her to seek every splinter of his essence, no matter the cost. But she never searches, she never questions, she only dreams of meeting the father she never knew, as if wishing could rewrite death itself. Number 15. How did she learn about Harry and his family? Delphi Diggory's appearance in Harry Potter and the Cursed Child carried with it the aura of a ghost no one had anticipated. Yet she swept into the story armed with a wealth of knowledge so comprehensive it bordered on implausible. This daughter of Lord Voldemort and Bellatrix Lestrange knew intimate details about Harry Potter's domestic life, from Albus Severus Potter's frustrations to the precise location of the family residence. No passage in the script reveals who supplied her with these particulars. The narrative treats her intelligence as a given, but in a world defined by surveillance spells and tight-knit wizarding circles, one must question when and how she gathered her facts. The text offers no scene showing Delphi infiltrating the Ministry of Magic's archives, nor does it imply she bribed any informant at the Daily Prophet. Instead, she simply emerges, fully prepared, as if she had absorbed decades of history through osmosis. The peculiar thing is that Delphi is described as having been raised in secret by Euphemia Rawle, a reclusive guardian whose primary concern was to keep her hidden from those who might suspect her lineage. It is stated in the play that she was kept safe and ignorant of her true heritage, yet she somehow acquired an encyclopedic awareness of Harry's family and his closest allies. One is left to assume that she must have spent countless hours studying every article and public record ever published about the boy who lived, but even this conjecture strains credulity, for nowhere does she recount any moment of methodical research. There is no mention of old prophet clippings pinned to her walls or enchanted devices eavesdropping on Albus's conversations at Hogwarts. The text provides no line in which Delphi boasts of using a charm to slip unnoticed into Harry's home or to read his private letters. Instead, she simply exists as a well-informed antagonist, a knowledge unchallenged by narrative logic. In Act 3, Scene 17, she reveals to Albus that she knows his father has a hidden vulnerability, his deep fear of failing those he loves. While it is reasonable to think such a fear might be inferred by anyone who had studied Harry's wartime exploits, it is quite another matter to understand the subtleties of Albus's discontent and how precisely it shaped Harry's parenting. Delphi appears to possess the psychological insight of a professional legilimens without any evidence she practiced that skill. The play never suggests she trained under a dark wizard who taught her to extract memories, nor that she ever encountered Snape's old occlumency lessons preserved in any form. One wonders whether her understanding of the Potters was conjured by the playwrights purely for narrative convenience. Delphi demonstrates knowledge of Albus's insecurities in a manner that is too specific to be gleaned from newspapers alone. For instance, she knows that Albus felt overshadowed by his father's fame and that he struggled to make friends. These are not the kinds of details likely to be chronicled by Rita Skeeter in her exposés. A child's loneliness is typically confined to private moments, to conversations whispered across Gryffindor dormitories or shared behind closed doors. No line in the script clarifies how she learned them. She was never seen trailing Albus at Hogwarts under the invisibility cloak or bribing portraits for secrets. Yet she recounts them with such confidence that no character pauses to ask, "How do you know all this?" It is also unclear how Delphi pinpointed the Potter's residence and determined that Albus would be at King's Cross Station during the departure to Hogwarts. The Potter household was not exactly a public venue, and Harry had learned enough caution to avoid advertising his address. Even if she had discovered their street name, the play never depicts her scouring directories or obtaining the Flu Network records. One must imagine her poring over some hidden archive or consulting an accomplice within the ministry, but the text offers not a single clue to confirm this. Instead, the reader must simply accept that she appeared at the right moment with the right knowledge. The absurdity deepens when considering the limitations imposed on Delphi's upbringing. Euphemia Roll, her caretaker, was portrayed as a woman determined to protect her from exposure. She did not permit Delphi to socialize or cultivate relationships with other wizarding families. Her isolation was intended to shield her identity. Yet Delphi somehow became familiar with every major figure of Harry's generation. She knew Ron and Hermione's prominence in the ministry, the timeline of Cedric Diggory's death, and the lasting trauma it caused. These elements were never explained as the fruit of correspondence or even illicit surveillance. They simply existed in Delphi's mind as a complete dossier. Her capacity to devise a plan to alter time itself depended on this improbable familiarity. She orchestrated the Time Turner heist and manipulated Albus's curiosity because she had a sophisticated grasp of the relationships among Harry's circle. For example, she understood precisely which combination of guilt and resentment would compel Albus and Scorpius to meddle in the Tri-Wizard tournament. In Act 2, Scene 16, when she remarks, "It must be hard to be the son of Harry Potter," the line lands with unsettling precision. It demonstrates that she not only knew the facts of Harry's life, but also the psychological currents driving his son. The text never accounts for how she acquired such profound intelligence. The play further fails to clarify how Delphi learned of the Time Turner's creation in the first place. Hermione, as Minister for Magic, had hidden it with layers of enchantments in her private office. This was not a secret that would have circulated in gossip columns. For Delphi to even suspect the artifact existed required inside knowledge from within the highest ranks of the ministry. The text provides no suggestion that she ever infiltrated the building or communicated with any confidant of Hermione. There is no flashback showing her disguised as an aura or rummaging through Hermione's drawers. One must simply assume she possessed a supernatural intuition for secrets. Number 16. Why did no one know about her birth? Bellatrix. Lestrange had always been a figure of unwavering devotion and reckless violence, a woman whose fanatic loyalty to Voldemort became almost a myth in the halls of Malfoy Manor and the darkened corners of the wizarding world. But the idea that she bore Voldemort's child, Delphi, without so much as a whisper reaching the ears of the Death Eaters strains the boundaries of plausibility. Bellatrix was not a recluse. She attended strategy meetings, she tortured captives, she duelled alongside her master in full view of their followers. Even in the most secretive regimes, the physical realities of pregnancy are difficult to disguise completely. The narrative suggests that Bellatrix remained fully engaged in the Second Wizarding War's bloody activities until the final battle at Hogwarts, never retreating to confinement or seclusion. Rodolphus Lestrange, her husband and fellow Death Eater, would have been the most immediate witness to any change in her condition. Yet not a single line in the canonical books acknowledges any suspicion, any rumour, any flicker of curiosity from Rodolphus, Rabastan, or even Narcissa Malfoy, who shared the same household. One must consider how Voldemort's personality made the prospect of secrecy even less likely. Tom Riddle had built his power on intimidation and spectacle. When he rose again in the little Hangleton graveyard, he called together his servants and forced them to kneel before him, mocking their failures. When he seized control of the ministry, he let the Muggle-born Registration Commission sow terror. His triumphs were public, his threats were theatrical. He was a creature who wanted the world to witness his return to supremacy. It defies logic that he would father a child and hide the fact so thoroughly that not even his most trusted lieutenants could guess. Voldemort's paranoia could explain a partial veil of secrecy, but not the total absence of all rumour. Even a tyrant cannot erase the human tendency to gossip, especially when that tyrant is known to punish perceived disloyalty with the Cruciatus curse. Fear creates silence to a point, but it rarely breeds absolute ignorance among an entire network of spies and soldiers. Consider, too, the proximity of Bellatrix to the Malfoy family during the period when Delphi was supposedly conceived and born. The Malfoys were forced hosts to Voldemort in the final year of the war. Draco's mother, Narcissa, would have shared hallways, meals, and anxious hours with Bellatrix. Yet neither Draco nor Narcissa ever remarks on any change in Bellatrix's appearance or behavior. Draco in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows is depicted as observant, haunted by the escalating brutality in his home. He notices when prisoners are moved, when Voldemort is displeased, when Lucius is humiliated, but he notices nothing about his aunt preparing to give birth to Voldemort's daughter. That silence feels contrived, especially since Delphi's existence would have represented a potential claim to the Dark Lord's legacy, something that surely would have been of political consequence if the Death Eaters had triumphed. When Bellatrix appears at Malfoy Manor to torture Hermione Granger, she is described as panting, wild-eyed, her wand shaking in her hand. This occurs mere weeks before the Battle of Hogwarts, the period when she would have been in late pregnancy if the timeline were to align. The physical demands of duelling, prolonged torture, and constant travel would have been nearly impossible for any witch at such an advanced stage. The text never hints at her showing signs of fatigue beyond her characteristic mania. Voldemort himself is described by J.K. Rowling as regarding her with a mixture of scorn and amusement. He does not acknowledge her as the mother of any child, nor does he issue special protections or accommodations. The absence of these details suggests that the entire premise of Delphi's secret birth was grafted onto the canon without sufficient regard for the established behaviours of the characters. One cannot ignore that Voldemort, who had scorned love and family ties as weaknesses, suddenly possessing an heir, undermines the philosophical foundation of his character. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore explains, "You are quite right. Voldemort never wanted a friend. He wanted followers. The birth of a child implies at least a momentary acceptance of the most human vulnerability. Yet no one in his inner circle suspects this transformation. The Death Eaters were a cult of personality, but they were also ambitious and many had hopes of power. Had anyone guessed that Bellatrix carried the Dark Lord's heir, it would have unleashed rivalries, conspiracies, perhaps even attempts to seize or manipulate the child to secure favour or succession. The lack of any such intrigue seems at odds with the ruthless opportunism that defined Voldemort's followers. If Bellatrix had withdrawn from public life to conceal the pregnancy, it would have caused logistical disruptions. Her absence from raids, meetings, and battles would have been noted. She was a critical instrument of Voldemort's terror, the most feared witch in his ranks, the one who murdered Sirius Black and tortured Frank and Alice Longbottom into madness. Her presence was indispensable, yet there is no record of a prolonged absence, no references to Bellatrix's illness or mission abroad. The books depict her appearing repeatedly in full view without explanation or comment. That erasure feels artificial, as though the narrative demanded that everyone avert their eyes simultaneously and pretend not to see. Even if Voldemort had used magical concealment, such as glamour charms or illusions, it strains credulity to think that he could maintain that deception in the daily life of the Malfoy household. The Fidelius charm can hide a place, but no charm described in the series can make an entire pregnancy invisible to every observer indefinitely. Polyjuice Potion might offer temporary disguise, but its preparation requires time and secrecy Bellatrix did not possess while constantly engaged in military operations. Moreover, Polyjuice Potion's transformations are imperfect. They cannot replicate the exact physical strain or behavior of late pregnancy. It is inconceivable that no one ever noticed the smallest inconsistency. Number 17. Why would Voldemort allow an heir? In the dim recesses of wizarding lore, there exists no contradiction more profound than the idea that Lord Voldemort, the Dark Lord who had devoted every sinew of his being to escaping mortality, would willingly create a child who could one day supplant him. The Harry Potter canon, particularly the 7th book, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, paints a vivid picture of Tom Riddle as a man who viewed all forms of attachment as weakness. When Voldemort stood before his followers, he never so much as hinted that legacy or progeny were remotely part of his ambitions. His horcruxes were his children in all. But name, fragments of a splintered soul, each hidden with desperate cunning, because in the end, the only continuity he trusted was his own fractured existence. Yet in The Cursed Child, the appearance of Delphine as Voldemort's daughter emerges like an unsettling fracture across the philosophical bedrock of the character. If he had spent decades shattering any vestige of humanity within himself, why would he have committed to the most human act of all? The books are unequivocal about Voldemort's revulsion for any notion of lineage. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore explains to Harry with a grave certainty that Voldemort's mother, Merop Gaunt, had only succeeded in bringing him into the world by force of a love potion. Voldemort had no use for family. His father, Tom Riddle Sr., was murdered without a flicker of remorse. His ancestors were little more than a footnote to justify his claim to Slytherin's bloodline. To imagine that this same man who took such fanatical pride in being an orphaned, self-made icon of terror would suddenly desire to produce a successor is not simply inconsistent but antithetical to everything he ever professed. When Voldemort declared, "There is no good and evil, there is only power and those too weak to seek it," he was pronouncing the creed of a creature determined to conquer death, not to cede life. Delphine's existence, as recounted in The Cursed Child, suggests that at some point during the Second Wizarding War, Voldemort and Bellatrix Lestrange became entwined in a secret pact to produce an heir. This act, if it occurred, would have coincided with the height of Voldemort's campaign to obliterate anyone he regarded as unworthy. He was so consumed with domination that he carved lightning-shaped scars into the psyches of children, shattered families, and desecrated tombs. To argue that he paused his relentless war to indulge in procreation requires a suspension of disbelief so complete that it borders on absurdity. The notion that Voldemort saw any value in the succession of his bloodline directly contradicts his most enduring fixation, that he alone should remain. If one studies the dark rituals he used to fracture his soul, it becomes clearer still that his purpose was never continuity through others. As Hermione read from Secrets of the Darkest Art, to rip the soul apart is to violate the deepest laws of magic, a desecration so complete that it severs the very concept of kinship. Each horcrux was an explicit rejection of ordinary mortality. Each was an assertion that Voldemort's essence would outlive any flesh. Had he valued offspring, he might have dedicated a horcrux to Delphine herself, ensuring she would guard part of his soul. But no such protection was entrusted to her. She was conceived, hidden, and ultimately abandoned to a fate unworthy of his notice. Perhaps most revealing is Voldemort's reaction to the prophecy concerning Harry Potter. The words, "neither can live while the other survives," drove him to obliterate an infant rather than accept any uncertainty to his primacy. If the mere possibility of a child growing up to challenge him provoked a murderous obsession, why would he sanction the existence of his own daughter? An heir is not simply a continuation of a bloodline. An heir is the embodiment of eventual replacement. Every instinct Voldemort displayed, from murdering his father to slaughtering James and Lily Potter, was an instinct to eradicate anything that might one day grow into a threat. Even his followers, the Death Eaters, were extensions of his will, not partners in an enduring enterprise. Bellatrix Lestrange, the most fanatical of them all, declared with breathless devotion, "The Dark Lord will rise again, Sissy. He will return." Yet when he did return, he never spoke of creating a dynasty. His public proclamations were always about conquest and purification, never about siring children. He demanded loyalty, fear, and submission, not legacy. The rituals he performed in the Little Hangleton graveyard, where he regained corporeal form, involved the bone of the father, the flesh of the servant, and the blood of the enemy, an unholy trinity that excluded any concept of posterity. The dissonance becomes more glaring when one considers the symbolism Voldemort constructed around himself. He chose the name Voldemort, shedding Tom Riddle like a skin. He fashioned a serpent familiar, Nagini, whose presence mirrored the serpentine corruption in his own soul. Even the dark mark burned into the arms of his followers was a sign of ownership, not of family. When he spoke to the Death Eaters, it was always, "my friends," never "my children." The Dark Lord's power was founded upon the obliteration of the human impulse to belong or bequeath. It was a form of spiritual autophagy, consuming every bond so that nothing remained but himself. Number 18. Why wasn't she mentioned in the post-war world? The final battle in the Great Hall of Hogwarts had left the air tasting of ash and victory, and for many in the wizarding world, the death of Lord Voldemort meant that no trace of his influence would ever stain their lives again. Yet it is precisely this finality that makes the later emergence of Delphine, the alleged daughter of the Dark Lord, so bewildering. No one, from the wizened auras of the Ministry to the wary witches and wizards rebuilding their homes, seemed to harbour even a rumour that Voldemort had conceived a child. Harry Potter himself, whose life had been shadowed by every dark whisper about Tom Riddle, encountered no clue that his nemesis had left behind any living heir. The Ministry of Magic, having suffered through 2 brutal wars, had established entire departments devoted to identifying Death Eater remnants, cataloguing cursed artifacts, and preventing any resurgence of dark ideology. It is therefore astonishing that a figure as consequential as Delphine could exist without even a single parchment in the archives to mark her birth. Consider Hermione Granger, who, as Minister for Magic later on, would have been privy to every classified file and intelligence report. This is the same Hermione who once said, "Fear of a name increases fear of the thing itself," and whose vigilance against anything connected to Voldemort was legendary. Would she truly have tolerated the silence that surrounded Delphine's origins? It defies every precedent that she and the Aura Office would neglect to investigate even the possibility of a child born from the union of Voldemort and Bellatrix Lestrange. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Voldemort's followers were hunted relentlessly. Travers was interrogated, Malfoy Manor was searched, and even lesser-known sympathizers were tracked to the farthest corners of Britain. And yet not one question arose about Bellatrix's prolonged absence from battles shortly before the end. In those desperate months before Voldemort's final downfall, Bellatrix was conspicuously absent from the front lines for long stretches. She, who had never willingly left her master's side, vanished into the shadows. The explanation offered in The Cursed Child is that she was pregnant in Malfoy Manor, hidden from view while the rest of the war raged. But if this was the case, why did no witness recall her condition, no prisoner or spy report her seclusion, and no captured Death Eater ever trade the knowledge of such a scandalous secret to save themselves from Azkaban? Narcissa Malfoy, so eager to protect her own family that she lied to Voldemort about Harry's death, might have shared a whispered word about Bellatrix's pregnancy if it meant shielding Draco from suspicion. Yet in the record of post-war trials and testimonies, there is a gaping silence. The Cursed Child expects readers to accept that the daughter of the most feared dark wizard in history was born and raised without so much as a flicker of interest from the entire wizarding establishment. After the war, the ministry enacted strict laws to register magical births precisely to prevent hidden dynasties of dark magic from rising. Kingsley Shacklebolt, the interim minister, was determined to root out every trace of Voldemort's legacy. He personally oversaw the confiscation of dark objects and the interviews of every known Death Eater. Even Kreacher, the house elf whose knowledge of Regulus Black and the Locket Horcrux proved vital, was questioned. Yet somehow no inkling of Bellatrix's child arose. When you remember that Bellatrix had been imprisoned in Azkaban, and her movements after her escape were under constant observation, the idea that she could secretly carry Voldemort's heir to term without discovery strains credibility. There is also the question of magical lineage. The wizarding world has always been obsessed with blood purity and genealogy. Families like the Blacks, the Malfoys, and the Lestranges kept detailed records of their heritage, etched in grim tapestries and guarded in vaults. The Black family tree described in Order of the Phoenix traces every cousin and distant branch, yet no scribe ever noted that Bellatrix bore a child. Sirius Black once spat contempt for his relatives and their obsession with lineage, but even he would have understood the political earthquake that Voldemort's heir represented. In that light, it is implausible that no genealogy was ever updated, no vault secured, and no legal claim registered for the child of Bellatrix and Voldemort. After Voldemort's defeat, fear did not vanish overnight. Parents still checked under beds for masked intruders, and children had nightmares of red eyes in the darkness. Hogwarts, once a haven, became a place of mourning and repair. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were invited to countless commemorations and inquiries. During these gatherings, Aurors and survivors swapped every scrap of intelligence. "The thing is, it all fits," Hermione once said while poring over old files, her quills scratching furiously across the margins. Yet, in the official record, no fitting theory about Delphini ever arose. Not even Rita Skeeter, who gleefully exposed private tragedies for profit, caught wind of such a sensational scandal. Imagine the headlines that would have erupted if even a shred of evidence suggested Voldemort had sired a child. Dark Lord's legacy lives on, new heir discovered. The wizarding press feasted on rumour and scandal in those days, and Skeeter's The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore proved that no secret was safe from exposure. Yet Delphini's existence remained submerged without a trace in the gossip columns, legal registries, or intelligence reports. It is a silence that feels not merely improbable but almost enchanted, as though an obliviate of colossal scope had scoured every mind and manuscript. Further, consider the stakes. A child of Voldemort would be a rallying symbol for any surviving Death Eater faction. Even the most fanatical loyalists like Rowell or Dolohov might have regrouped around Delphini as a living banner of their master's will. After the war, the wizarding world was still unstable enough that such a figure could have sparked fresh violence. Yet there is no record of the auras monitoring any such threat. No mention in the reconstructed Department of Magical Law Enforcement files, not one search warrant or confidential memo. It also defies belief that Harry Potter, whose scar still twinged at memories of Voldemort, would fail to investigate every rumor about the Dark Lord's bloodline. In Deathly Hallows, he refused to rest until every horcrux was destroyed. He would have understood that a biological heir posed a danger almost as grave as a fragment of soul. Yet in The Cursed Child, Harry learns of Delphini's existence as if it were a revelation from thin air. This sudden ignorance is jarring, considering how thoroughly he devoted himself to eradicating Voldemort's lingering influence. From a narrative standpoint, it is convenient to erase all evidence of Delphini's birth because her sudden arrival generates shock. But this convenience comes at the cost of logic. It asks readers to believe that every institution, every vigilant survivor, every gossiping witch in Knockturn Alley simply forgot to ask where Bellatrix disappeared in the months before the battle. This stretches suspension of disbelief past the breaking point. No other detail in the canon has ever required such collective amnesia. Even tiny traces of dark magic were pored over. When Umbridge wore the locket of Slytherin, the theft was eventually discovered. When Xenophilius Lovegood printed the Deathly Hallows symbol, the Ministry reacted. But the birth of a child by Voldemort, a fact that would reshape wizarding history, apparently left no mark at all. It is also remarkable that Draco Malfoy, who grew up in Malfoy Manor and was forced to host Voldemort and Bellatrix, never remarked upon the presence of an infant or a heavily pregnant aunt. Draco later served on the Hogwarts Board of Governors and worked to rehabilitate his family's name. He had every incentive to reveal any threat to the fragile peace, especially one that could implicate his household again. But Draco, too, is portrayed as ignorant, as if his memories had been tampered with or erased. The wizarding world survived Voldemort's terror by learning hard lessons about vigilance and remembrance. In the Philosopher's Stone, Dumbledore said, "To the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure." But he also knew that forgetting the past invites its return. The total absence of any documented suspicion about Delphini betrays that principle. It is a narrative convenience rather than an organic consequence of the world rolling so carefully built. And in that sense, the story of Voldemort's daughter is not merely improbable, it is a tale that the wizarding world, in all its fear and caution, would never have failed to tell. Number 19, how did she learn about the prophecy? Delphi Diggory, or rather Delphi Riddle as she claims herself to be, emerges in Harry Potter and the Cursed Child with a chilling certainty about her destiny, brandishing knowledge of a prophecy that binds her to the return of Lord Voldemort. The script insists on this prophecy's importance without ever truly explaining its origin, which immediately casts suspicion on the entire foundation of her plan. Within the world J.K. Rowling constructed, prophecies are not casual rumors whispered in dark corners. They are powerful, unpredictable truths spoken by seers and carefully locked away, as evidenced by the entire saga of Harry's own prophecy with Voldemort, which is stored in the Department of Mysteries, out of reach of all but those named within it. Delphi's awareness of hers is presented without fanfare or explanation, leaving the reader struggling to understand how this self-styled heir to the Dark Lord could possess something so jealously guarded by the Ministry of Magic. This contradiction becomes even more severe when considering that no canonical source suggests a legitimate record of a prophecy about her. The only precedent for such a prophecy being publicly known in the wizarding world is Sybil Trelawney's pronouncement about Harry and Voldemort, heard by Snape, whose partial report drove Voldemort to act. That prophecy was stored in a delicate glass sphere in the Hall of Prophecies, surrounded by thousands of others, accessible only to those named. If Delphi's prophecy existed in the same manner, there is no evidence she, had ministry clearance, powerful allies, or the cunning to infiltrate the Department of Mysteries. She is depicted instead as an isolated, secretive orphan raised by Euphemia Rawle, a minor Death Eater sympathizer with no real connections to the power structures of Voldemort's fallen army. Consider the Ministry of Magic's security measures, painstakingly described in Order of the Phoenix, where even Voldemort himself could not simply break in unnoticed. Harry's disastrous mission to retrieve the prophecy ends in the destruction of countless records, implying that such objects are fragile, dangerous, and tightly guarded. For Delphi to claim knowledge of a prophecy about her own ascendance is therefore not just a stretch, but a direct conflict with the world-building Rowling established. No Death Eater is described as having retained access to the Department of Mysteries after Voldemort's fall, and the Ministry underwent reforms after the war, rooting out known sympathizers. The idea that Delphi could stroll in and collect this crucial knowledge is simply not supported by any evidence in the text. Moreover, if the prophecy did exist, the logical question is who actually spoke it. Trelawney's visions are the best-known examples of true prophecy, and her delivery was chaotic, unbidden, and involuntary. We never hear who allegedly foretold Delphi's role, nor is any record presented in Cursed Child. The script merely asserts it: I am the augury, I am the prophecy. These are Delphi's own words, but they are a self-proclamation, not proof. There is no mention of her producing a physical prophecy sphere, or naming the seer who delivered it. For all her talk of destiny, she offers no evidence beyond her word. This absence is damning, especially in a world where prophecies are known to be documented and kept under tight control. Even her personal history fails to provide an avenue for acquiring such a prophecy. Raised in hiding, presumably to protect her from those who might wish to see Voldemort's bloodline extinguished, Delphi was not the product of a thriving underground Death Eater movement. By the time she is an adult, the scattered Death Eaters have either been imprisoned, reformed, or gone deep underground. Figures like Draco Malfoy have no interest in restoring the Dark Lord, and the remaining fanatics, such as the Carrows, are never shown. Organizing around Delphi, there is no support structure through which she might have learned about an alleged prophecy, much less confirmed its existence or wording. The only remote possibility would be some private Death Eater knowledge, yet even that fails under scrutiny. Voldemort himself never believed in preparing for an heir. His obsession with immortality and his repeated failures to understand love make it absurd to think he would have commissioned or cared about a prophecy concerning a child he never planned to have. Indeed, Voldemort's fear of death drove him to reject all forms of legacy except his own continued rule. As Dumbledore tells Harry in Half-Blood Prince, Voldemort seeks to overcome death itself, not pass power to another. This makes the very notion of a prophecy about his daughter deeply unconvincing in the first place. If Delphi had somehow stumbled upon the prophecy by accident, it would have required circumstances the story does not bother to invent. In Order of the Phoenix, prophecies shatter when handled by those not named in them. Harry's own sphere nearly breaks in the Department of Mysteries when touched by anyone else. No scene in Cursed Child describes Delphi discovering such an object, much less retrieving it undetected. The narrative simply skips over the hardest question, how she knows about it at all. For a work that claims to expand upon Rowling's world, this is a devastating oversight. It demands the audience accept not only that the prophecy exists, but that Delphi knows its precise contents with perfect certainty, despite having no means of learning it. The consequences of this logical gap are enormous for the credibility of the story. If Delphi is lying about the prophecy to manipulate Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy, the script never suggests it, instead treating her words as fact. This is a missed opportunity to deepen her character, to present her as a con artist, drawing on the wizarding world's fear of prophecies to create her own self-fulfilling destiny. Instead, the narrative embraces her claims at face value. She becomes the vessel of fate without ever earning that role through the rules the series itself laid down so meticulously. Her entire plan hinges on this knowledge. She believes she is destined to return Voldemort to power, and she bases every manipulation of the Time Turner around that belief. Yet the script provides no explanation for why she trusts this destiny so absolutely without a clear source for the prophecy. Her faith appears not determined or tragic, but absurd. She is a fanatic without a gospel, a believer in a scripture that is never quoted. When she snarls, "I am the augury, the bringer of dark times," it sounds like empty theatre, because the story fails to explain how she came by such certainty. Rowling's original series, in contrast, was always scrupulous about the danger of self-fulfilling prophecies and the consequences of misinterpretation. Delphi's story drops these complexities in favour of hollow destiny. One might argue that Euphemia Roll told her of the prophecy, but the text never confirms Euphemia possessed such knowledge. Roll is depicted as a caretaker, a sympathizer, not a grand strategist or guardian of ancient secrets. If Roll did know, how did she learn? The Death Eaters were fractured after Voldemort's death, and there is no suggestion in the text that Roll was privy to any surviving core leadership or the secrets of the Department of Mysteries. Instead, the play glosses over this entirely, offering no origin for the supposed prophecy beyond Delphi's repeated assertions. Perhaps most frustratingly, the play tries to grant her gravitas by surrounding her with prophetic language while refusing to do the hard work of world-building. It recycles the aesthetic of ominous predictions without explaining why this one should be trusted. The line, "When spares are spared, when time is turned," sounds suitably cryptic, but is not given the same canonical weight as Trelawney's true prophecies. It is never heard spoken by a seer in trance, never confirmed by an authority, and never even written down. The audience is simply told to believe Delphi because she believes herself, which is a weak foundation for a story rooted in destiny. This is all the more glaring because Rowling's books repeatedly emphasized how prophecies could be misunderstood or twisted. Voldemort's downfall came precisely because he acted on a partial prophecy, interpreting it to his ruin. Harry's survival was built on love's power to subvert fate. Cursed Child seems to forget this lesson, offering instead a prophecy that is clear, convenient, and unchallenged. There is no ambiguity in Delphi's plan, no fear she might be wrong. The absence of doubt cheapens the drama and flattens her as a villain, reducing her to a predictable throwback rather than a tragic figure haunted by uncertainty. Delphi's certainty also invites comparison to Voldemort himself, who spent years trying to obtain the full prophecy about Harry. He dispatched Death Eaters to the Department of Mysteries, risking exposure and war to hear its precise wording. That obsession highlights the impossibility of Delphi's casual knowledge. If Voldemort couldn't simply conjure prophecies at will, why should we believe his secret daughter could? This inconsistency is never addressed. The play effectively asks the audience to forget the entire Department of Mysteries subplot and its implications for how prophecy works in this universe. The result is a character who is fascinating in concept, but frustrating in execution. Delphi Riddle could have been a master manipulator, exploiting wizarding superstition, weaving her own legend around frightened children, eager to believe in fate. Instead, she is presented as genuinely chosen, the subject of a missing prophecy no one bothers to prove. In a series famous for its careful plotting and internal consistency, this represents a rare and disappointing lapse. It is as if the writers assumed that the trappings of prophecy were enough, forgetting that in Harry's world, those trappings were always bound to costs, dangers, and the risk of fatal misunderstanding. Number 20, why didn't anyone see her training? Delphi's existence in Harry Potter and the Cursed Child sparks countless questions that the narrative never fully addresses. Yet among the most confounding is the matter of her magical education. The script implies that she became a formidable practitioner of dark arts, capable of manipulating time itself and dueling seasoned wizards, but nowhere in the book is it convincingly explained how she acquired these skills without attracting the vigilant eyes of the Ministry of Magic. After Voldemort's defeat, the wizarding community was gripped by an anxious vigilance that saw auras and informants reporting the slightest rumors of dark activity. It is almost impossible to believe that Delphi could have honed such proficiency in curses, enchantments, and magical theory in total secrecy, especially when the Ministry had an entire department dedicated to monitoring residual Death Eater networks and any attempt to rekindle Voldemort's ideology. Delphi's alleged upbringing under the guardianship of Euphemia Roll further strains credibility. The Roll family had long been linked to the darker corners of wizarding society, but even they could not have maintained a hidden curriculum of magical training robust enough to produce a witch who could outwit and overpower trained auras. The official story describes Euphemia Roll as an elderly guardian, which suggests an advanced age and diminished capacity to act as a covert instructor. One must question whether a woman of her years could single-handedly design and conduct the rigorous training regimen required to turn a child into a master of the unforgivable curses. The notion grows more dubious when we recall that Roll herself was under Ministry scrutiny due to the known affiliations of her kin. The cursed child provides no evidence, no references to hidden tutors, forbidden tomes, or concealed chambers of instruction that would substantiate Delphi's evolution into a magical prodigy. Throughout the entire narrative, Delphi demonstrates a degree of magical sophistication that should have set off alarms. For instance, she orchestrates the theft of Amos Diggory's Time Turner, an act requiring not only boldness, but deep knowledge of magical artifacts and their protection spells. After the events of the Second Wizarding War, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement implemented protocols to audit and secure every known Time Turner, precisely to prevent abuses of temporal magic. As the text recounts, all Time Turners were thought destroyed, yet Delphi not only locates the last surviving device, but also manipulates Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy into retrieving it on her behalf. A witch capable of such elaborate schemes must have spent years learning concealment charms, protective enchantments, and the intricacies of magical law. The question remains, where did this education happen, and why did no one think to investigate Euphemia Roll's isolated estate? It is well documented in the books that even during Voldemort's first rise to power, secrecy was an elusive goal. Severus Snape, who was a far subtler spy than Delphi, still fell under Dumbledore's watchful eye. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore remarks, "You are talented, Severus, but you are not invisible." By that logic, how could Delphi, with far fewer resources than her father's original followers, maintain years of clandestine study undetected? The Ministry had doubled the staff assigned to track. Former Death Eaters and magical signatures were monitored for suspicious patterns. A teenage girl channeling significant amounts of magical energy in remote practice would have left a trail of traceable spell residue. Yet no trace was ever found. No informant ever whispered her name into the Aura office. No curious neighbor reported flickers of dark light or the smell of burning herbs that often accompany complex curses. The core narrative of Delphi's rise leans heavily on the assumption that her guardian was both powerful and motivated enough to build a hidden schoolhouse within the walls of a private dwelling. Even so, this raises additional problems. Advanced dueling cannot be learned from books alone. It requires live opponents and the feedback of experienced practitioners to master timing, spellcasting under pressure, and defensive reflexes. Who sparred with Delphi while she perfected the blasting curse or rehearsed the killing curse she later attempted to unleash? Euphemia Roll herself. This would suggest that an elderly woman retained not only her faculties, but also the stamina to engage in repeated combat training without notice from the Ministry's surveillance charms. It also implies that she willingly risked Azkaban to shape the daughter of Voldemort into a deadly weapon, yet no credible motivation for such devotion is ever offered in the script. Even the less conspicuous elements of Delphi's skill set are suspect. She is shown to be fluent in occlumency and legilimency, abilities so advanced that few wizards ever achieved them. Snape was one of the rare masters, having practiced them for decades. In Order of the Phoenix, he warns Harry, "The mind is not a book, to be opened at will and examined at leisure." Delphi somehow becomes adept enough to conceal her thoughts from multiple trained observers. That accomplishment alone suggests either the presence of a hidden mentor of extraordinary ability or years of formal instruction. Neither possibility fits the narrative's claim that she was a neglected orphan raised in obscurity. The lack of any reference to even a single textbook or secret correspondence makes the claim almost impossible to accept. Her apparent mastery of wandless and nonverbal magic is equally implausible. When she finally reveals her true identity, Delphi immobilizes Albus and Scorpius in one fluid motion, performing spells without incantation. Nonverbal casting is considered an advanced discipline, usually not mastered until after Hogwarts graduation. Hermione Granger, arguably the most studious witch of her generation, required years to achieve proficiency. For Delphi to wield these techniques at such a young age, and to do so without having attended Hogwarts, defies the established rules of magical education. The cursed child simply expects readers to believe she acquired this talent without institutional support or detection by the Department of Magical Education. Moreover, Delphi's proficiency with the Fidelius charm and other concealment spells suggests she had access to magical resources far beyond the reach of an average witch. Even seasoned auras struggled to break the protections Voldemort once used to hide his followers. The idea that Delphi, a solitary figure in her 20s, could master such charms in secrecy is inconsistent with everything the Harry Potter series taught us about the difficulty of hiding magical activity. After all, the Ministry was able to trace illegal magic performed by underage wizards with pinpoint accuracy, as when Harry received a letter after using the Patronus charm on Privet Drive. The notion that no trace of Delphi's practice ever appeared in the records is another glaring inconsistency. This pattern of unexplained mastery extends to her manipulation of prophecy. Delphi quotes the prophecy word for word, exploits its language to shape the actions of others, and exhibits a familiarity with divination that would require extensive study. The Department of Mysteries has always guarded prophetic records with the utmost security. No mention is ever made of how Delphi acquired a copy or learned to interpret it. Given her age, she could not have personally witnessed the prophecy's original recording. Euphemia Roll is never described as a seer, nor does the story offer any suggestion of a stolen pensive memory or secret archive. Once. Again, the narrative expects the audience to overlook the implausibility. Consider also the practical aspects of Delphi's concealment. For years, she moved about in wizarding society without so much as a rumor of her true heritage. Even the most obscure Death Eater children were eventually catalogued and tracked by the Office for the Detection and Confiscation of Dark Artifacts. Draco Malfoy endured years of Ministry surveillance after the war ended, and he had publicly renounced his father's ideology. It strains credulity that no record of Bellatrix Lestrange's pregnancy or Delphi's birth survived the chaos of Voldemort's final months. St. Mungo's Hospital, where childbirth almost certainly occurred, maintained scrupulous patient records. Yet Delphi's birth certificate is never produced, nor does anyone ever question how she materialized as a grown woman so well versed in dark enchantments. In the end, the most charitable explanation is that the narrative sacrifices plausibility for dramatic effect. Delphi emerges fully formed, a dark sorceress with the composure and confidence of a much older practitioner. She manipulates the descendants of Harry Potter's generation and nearly reshapes the past without ever revealing a trace of her apprenticeship. But in a world where the smallest magical infraction triggers a Ministry investigation, the absence of any account of her education remains a hole too large to ignore. This omission undermines the realism that made the original 7 books so immersive, leaving Delphi's rise as a cautionary example of storytelling that demands too much unquestioned acceptance. Number 21. Why didn't she use legilimency? In Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, Delphi Diggory emerges as the daughter of Lord Voldemort and Bellatrix Lestrange, a revelation intended to electrify the audience with its dark, sensational twist. She is described as determined, sly, and frighteningly focused on resurrecting her father's legacy. Yet her characterization unravels under scrutiny, especially when we examine her supposed magical heritage. Voldemort was a master legilimens. Able to break into minds with terrifying ease, he left Harry gasping in pain with visions of the snake or tortured with dreams of corridors. Even Snape acknowledged Voldemort's prowess, telling Harry that the Dark Lord, for instance, almost always knows. Someone is lying to him. Delphi, Voldemort's own daughter, would seem the perfect vessel to inherit this brutal psychic precision. But in the play, her schemes never involve legilimency or occlumency, instead falling back on lies and persuasion so mundane it strains believability. One particularly glaring moment occurs when Delphi manipulates Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy into helping her steal the Time Turner from Hermione Granger's office at the Ministry of Magic. Delphi convinces them with grand speeches about saving Cedric Diggory's life. Yet the entire plan hinges on teenage gullibility. A daughter of Voldemort should need no such gambit. She could simply peer into their thoughts, sense their fears, exploit the deepest cracks in their friendship. This is no idle speculation. Voldemort himself used legilimency as his preferred method of intimidation and control. In Order of the Phoenix, we see Harry unable to hide anything from him without desperate occlumency training. Delphi, however, plays the charlatan with cheap con artist tricks, as if the playwrights forgot the defining trait of her father's terror. Delphi's failure to use these mind arts is especially baffling in the scene at St. Oswald's home for old witches and wizards. When she corners Albus and Scorpius in this dusty refuge, she relies on intimidation alone, revealing her true intentions with theatrical menace. "I am the augury," she says, and they are supposed to tremble at the prophecy. But there is no moment when she senses their doubts or struggles, no sign she is reading them. To adjust her strategy on the fly. Compare this with Voldemort's style, who could detect the flicker of betrayal or fear instantly. The daughter of the greatest legilimens in living memory would logically be equipped to ensure no one could lie to her at all. Instead, the scene becomes a pantomime of evil, stripped of the psychological horror her lineage promises. Even when Delphi confronts Albus and Scorpius in the church at Godric's Hollow, she relies on threats of violence and emotional appeals about her parentage. She explains she is the child of Bellatrix Lestrange and Lord Voldemort, with twisted pride, but she never attempts to reach inside their heads to ensure compliance or predict their moves. The choice to avoid legilimency here is a massive narrative oversight. It would have given her control over the boys in a chilling, believable way. Instead, the play asks us to accept that two teenage boys can resist her manipulation simply by being stubborn, a laughable notion if she had even a fraction of Voldemort's mental abilities. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore explains to Harry that Voldemort prized those who could hide their thoughts. He taught those close to him to be expert occlumens, to shut their minds to him. This makes sense only if Voldemort himself was an unstoppable legilimens. He would expect that power to work unless opposed by significant training, but Delphi never demonstrates even curiosity about whether Albus or Scorpius have mental defenses. She acts as if she has never heard of legilimency at all. This feels like a betrayal of the canon's internal logic. The audience is left to wonder how a daughter of Voldemort, trained in secret by Death Eater loyalists like Euphemia Roll, somehow missed learning the signature weapon of her father's arsenal. The scene in the Forbidden Forest is particularly embarrassing for her character. Delphi captures Albus and Scorpius, binds them magically, and explains her plan to travel back to October 31st, 1981, to prevent Voldemort's downfall. Albus tries to resist by insulting her, saying she's nothing, but Delphi merely yells at him like a villain in a bad melodrama. She does not look into his mind to see his next plan, does not see that they are trying to trick her. The play wants us to believe she's a cunning mastermind, yet she behaves with the subtlety of a troll. This is exactly where legitimacy would shine, pulling their fears and secrets out for her to exploit, making her a genuine threat rather than a shouting caricature. Consider how Voldemort uses legitimacy against Harry in Goblet of Fire when he realizes the boy is watching through his snake's eyes. He senses the connection immediately and exploits it to plant false visions. A Voldemort heir should be attuned to such links between people, sensitive to thoughts like a predator to blood in water. But Delphi is blind. She never even suspects that Albus and Scorpius are misleading her until it's too late. It's hard not to see this as lazy writing. The authors want the aesthetic of a Voldemort child, but refuse to grant her the actual menace it would entail. They want her to threaten the timeline, but not so effectively that the boys can't save the day. Hermione Granger, now Minister for Magic, is portrayed as a skilled occlumens herself, which would explain why Delphi couldn't trick her. But Albus and Scorpius are 15-year-olds with no such defenses. Even Snape tells Harry only those skilled at occlumency can shut down their minds to the Dark Lord. So there is no indication that either boy has had a single lesson in these arts. The implication is clear. Delphi's refusal or inability to read their minds is unearned mercy from the scriptwriters, not logical in-universe behavior. This removes the stakes from her encounters and makes her seem incompetent, draining the fear she might inspire. Delphi's origin story claims she was raised in secret by Euphemia Roll, a known Death Eater loyal to Voldemort's ideals. Are we to believe Euphemia would fail to teach her even the basics of her father's powers? The Death Eaters venerated Voldemort's magical mastery. Even Bellatrix, as deranged as she was, demonstrated dueling prowess and fierce loyalty to her master's methods. Delphi, as Bellatrix's daughter, should be especially gifted or at least deeply trained in these skills. Instead, she emerges with a single useful ability, flight without a broom. The play wants us to gasp at this uncanny feat, yet even this power was one Voldemort could grant his followers, as we saw with Snape escaping Hogwarts. Her inability to use legilimency seems an inexcusable omission in context. In the Order of the Phoenix, Harry describes the agony of being mentally invaded by Voldemort. "He's in my head! He's in my head!" This is not subtle magic. It's an intrusive, traumatic violation. It would have added powerful horror to Cursed Child if Delphi could use even a lesser version of this skill. Imagine Albus trying to lie to her while she rifles through his thoughts, exposing his fear of disappointing Harry, his resentment of his family legacy. Imagine her threatening to reveal these secrets unless he obeys. That would make her a true Voldemort heir, frightening in a way consistent with the saga's established rules. The Time Turner heist itself unravels when viewed through this lens. Delphi works with two highly emotional teenagers who are divided over their mission. She should sense Scorpius's unease, the guilt eating at him for meddling with time. Instead, she proceeds as though their loyalty is guaranteed. A skilled legilimens would anticipate defection, predict sabotage, and plan around it. Instead, Delphi seems genuinely shocked when they turn on her. Her dramatic final speech about the augury prophecy feels empty because the threat is purely physical. There is no psychological terror, no sense that she knows them better than they know themselves. Delphi's interactions with Harry disguised as Voldemort during the final confrontation are equally hollow. She is fooled by a transfiguration trick, unable to sense anything amiss. Yet Voldemort himself was so paranoid he dissected every betrayal with surgical precision. The idea that his own child would miss the deception entirely is insulting to the legacy of the character. Harry, in Deathly Hallows, had to close his mind utterly to survive, fearing that even a stray thought would doom them. But Delphi, supposed scion of the Dark Lord, fails at the one thing her father did best: Throughout Cursed Child, the writers attempt to give Delphi menace through prophecy and bloodline, but fail to equip her with the tools that would make that menace real. The absence of legitimacy is not a small oversight. It is the removal of the most chilling aspect of her heritage. Instead of the terrifying inevitability of her father's mental domination, we get a series of generic threats and violent gestures. It feels like the play wants the brand recognition of Voldemort without honoring the details that made him so frightening. The result is a villain whose plans collapse because she cannot read two boys' minds, a plot hole big enough to swallow the entire climax. It is not simply that Delphi is underpowered, but that her power is incoherent. She has flight, but not legilimency. She can duel, but not probe thoughts. She can bluff, but not see through lies. This inconsistent power set is not true to her lineage. Voldemort was defined by his ability to get into your head, to know your secrets before you did. Delphi, with access to Death Eater tutors and the blood of Bellatrix and Voldemort, should be unstoppable against untrained teenagers. Her failure to use these skills breaks immersion, reducing her from a mythic heir of evil to a common manipulator with a cheap, tragic backstory. The Cursed Child needed Delphi to be the true heir of Voldemort's terror, to make us believe the Dark Lord's blood lived on in her cunning and cruelty. Instead, it neuters her potential, leaving audiences to question if the writers understood the very villain they were reviving. They gave her his name, but denied her his mind. They draped her in prophecy, but stripped her of strategy. It is a fundamental failure of imagination, leaving Delphi not as the new Voldemort, but as a hollow echo of his shadow. Number 22. Why didn't she attempt Horcrux rituals? Delphi's determination to restore Lord Voldemort to power formed the central axis of her identity, but the path she chose seemed curiously incomplete, almost careless in its selective use of the dark arts. The Horcrux ritual, the very engine that had sustained Voldemort's uncanny survival, remained an unspoken option in her designs. As if the memory of it had evaporated into the haze of defeated nightmares, Delphi never once alluded to the process that splintered a soul and bound it to the living world. Yet this method had been the reason Voldemort lingered beyond death, a fact so unmistakably recorded that even first-year students whispered about it in the corridors of Hogwarts. Tom Riddle's own experiments had proven that as long as a fragment of soul clung to a vessel, he could never truly die. Delphi, raised in secret and presumably tutored in the most fanatical interpretations of her father's legend, disregarded this method so thoroughly it almost defied belief. While she pursued the convoluted plan of time travel to rewrite the outcome of the Battle of Hogwarts, Delphi might have considered that Voldemort had already demonstrated how a contingency rooted in Horcruxes could thwart even death itself. Her father's diaries, or at least the fragmented recollections of those who had witnessed his rise, described the creation of Horcruxes in detail, chilling enough to freeze the blood. Hermione Granger recounted in the Deathly Hallows how they had learned about the ritual's grim requirements. The fragment of soul which is forced out of the body can be encased in an object. A murder was the trigger, a deliberate severing of conscience that tore the soul apart. Even the Ministry of Magic, in its fervent campaign to cleanse the wizarding world of Voldemort's shadows, never claimed to have obliterated every scrap of information about these rites. There were clandestine corners of Nocturne Alley where aging wizards still whispered about the vanished tomes Voldemort once studied. Secrets of the darkest art had been hidden in the restricted section of the Hogwarts library for decades, and copies were rumored to exist in private collections. It strains logic to assume Delphi, who was bold enough to assassinate and kidnap in her pursuit of prophecy, never thought to retrieve a copy. If she had truly been willing to sacrifice anything, why not attempt to recreate the very process that had made her father immortal? A single ritual carried out with the same merciless conviction that once drove Tom Riddle to murder his own kin could have forged a new anchor for Voldemort's soul. And yet Delphi's scheme remained an exercise in theatrical nostalgia, staging a return to the past rather than a practical restoration in the present. The question of knowledge arises most forcefully when one recalls that even the least competent Death Eaters understood the principles of horcruxes. Bellatrix Lestrange, whose vault concealed Helga Hufflepuff's cup, must have possessed at least a rudimentary comprehension of the artifact's significance. Severus Snape, though he never created a horcrux himself, recognized the symptoms of a soul severed beyond repair. Delphi, in contrast, had the advantage of inheritance. She could have inherited her father's private writings, letters to followers, or at least memories from loyalists. Yet not once did she consider that Voldemort's greatest triumph over death had not been temporal manipulation, but the anchoring of his essence in objects of power. It was as if the script of her ambition had been stripped of its most logical act. A plausible excuse that the Ministry's Aura Office had scoured Britain clean of all materials on horcruxes cannot withstand scrutiny. While Kingsley Shacklebolt's administration undoubtedly committed resources to purging the dark arts, history shows that knowledge, especially the most forbidden kind, has a way of surviving persecution. The Black Family Library, partially catalogued by Hermione herself, contained countless tomes the Ministry never recovered. The Carrows, Thorfinn Roll, and other fugitive Death Eaters each fled with scraps of dark lore. In the years after Voldemort's fall, a witch as determined as Delphi could have tracked down these exiles and extracted their secrets by force or persuasion. And yet she enacted none of this, preferring instead to gamble everything on an encounter with prophecy that even her father had viewed as uncertain. There is an irony in this omission, because Voldemort himself never placed all his faith in prediction. The memory of Dumbledore's words in the Astronomy Tower still clings to every retelling. He never paused to understand the limitations of prophecy. Dumbledore understood that Voldemort's fear of death, not his belief in fate, fueled his obsession with horcruxes. The Dark Lord's meticulous preparations were evidence that he never trusted any single safeguard. Delphi, on the other hand, displayed a naivety almost insulting to her father's legacy. By resting all her hopes on travelling to 1981 and preventing Harry Potter's survival, she committed herself to an elaborate plan whose failure would leave her with nothing. The same single-minded devotion that made her dangerous also blinded her to the simplest solution. One can imagine how differently her efforts might have unfolded had she searched out a hidden ritual. Consider the scene if Delphi had obtained a cursed artifact, perhaps an heirloom of the Gaunt family, and performed the necessary murder to enshrine her father's remnant soul. Such an act, however monstrous, would have aligned her more accurately with the example Voldemort set. When Tom Riddle transformed Marvolo Gaunt's ring into a horcrux, he was barely older than Delphi herself during the events of the Cursed Child. He understood that the true conquest of mortality required desecration and sacrifice. Delphi, despite her reverence for his power, chose spectacle over substance. Even the Time Turner itself symbolized this weakness. Rather than treating it as a tool to gather knowledge, locate old allies, unearth horcrux-making rituals, she wielded it as a blunt instrument to rewrite destiny. It was a choice rooted in desperation and theatrical symbolism rather than the calculated cruelty Voldemort embodied. She believed that repeating the night of her father's defeat would restore his dominion, though the logic of that belief was as thin as parchment. And in doing so, she dismissed the one proven method that had preserved his life after the killing curse rebounded. The void in her plans becomes more absurd when one considers her meticulous intelligence gathering. Delphi knew the details of Harry Potter's story with unsettling precision. She recited names, dates, and locations with an obsession bordering on worship. The battle of the Department of Mysteries, the destruction of the Locket Horcrux, even the last hours of Severus Snape, she had studied them all. To know so much and yet not grasp the importance of Horcruxes defies not only logic but the character of a fanatic. When Hermione summarized in the Deathly Hallows that his soul was so mangled he could not die, it was no mere metaphor. It was the key to Voldemort's entire existence. Delphi, supposedly his most faithful heir, treated that key as if it had never existed. The possibility that Delphi considered horcruxes too corrupting to replicate seems laughable. This is a witch who murdered Craig Bowker Jr. without remorse, who threatened to slaughter children to secure her aims. The moral barrier to soul-splitting, if it ever existed, had long since been obliterated. Yet her actions implied she saw time travel as a cleaner, perhaps nobler, alternative to dark magic. That contradiction stands out as the most illogical part of her story. If she was prepared to stain her hands with innocent blood, why not perform the same profane ritual that had proven effective? Some readers suggest the narrative needed Delphi's scheme to hinge on time travel for theatrical reasons, but stories, especially those built on established lore, must also respect their own logic. If the audience is expected to believe in the unstoppable hunger that drives her, they deserve to see her pursue the most obvious means of fulfilling it. The silence around Horcruxes is not just a missing detail, it is a gaping wound in the plot's credibility. A character who reveres her father's legacy should never have ignored the very process that prolonged his life beyond the grave. The image of Delphi laboring alone in her hidden lair, consulting obscure manuscripts, interrogating survivors of the war, and experimenting with dreadful incantations, would have given her quest a grim authenticity. Instead, she appeared to drift from one melodramatic gesture to another, her devotion distilled into a pantomime of prophecy and revenge. Even Bellatrix Lestrange, from whom she inherited her lineage, understood that real power required sacrifice. The woman who kept the cup in her vault was no stranger to horror. That Delphi never embraced the same logic weakens her story until it threatens to collapse under its own contradictions. Readers may choose to forgive this omission as a concession to narrative economy, but they should at least acknowledge it for what it is, a convenient evasion of the most terrifying aspect of Voldemort's legacy. His refusal to die was not a matter of prophecy or chance, but the consequence of deliberate, ruthless decisions. Delphi's failure to mirror that same resolve ultimately reduces her from heir to imitator. She became an echo, rather than a continuation, of the Dark Lord's true genius for survival. Number 23. Why didn't she use dark magic fully? Delphi Diggory emerges from the pages of Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, bearing the most chilling pedigree imaginable. The supposed daughter of Lord Voldemort and Bellatrix Lestrange is introduced as an almost mythical dark heir, a culmination of evil bloodlines. The stage script goes out of its way to build her up as someone to fear. Albus Potter calls her incredibly powerful, and Scorpius Malfoy is genuinely terrified when he realizes who she really is. But if we examine her actions without the haze of the character's fear, a strange emptiness emerges. Despite this terrifying heritage, Delphi's actual use of dark magic is oddly sparse and disappointingly mundane. She's written as a master manipulator of children rather than a mistress of ancient and lethal curses. When she finally reveals herself at St. Oswald's home for old witches and wizards, it's the first time readers see her drop the mask. She disarms Albus and Scorpius with Expelliarmus and uses Incarcerus to bind them. These are school-level spells. The daughter of the Dark Lord himself, who slaughtered countless wizards and created an army of loyal Death Eaters with threats and fear, resorts to rope conjuring and wand disarming. It's as if she learned her father's infamy, but not his craft. Her claim to evil is theatrical rather than magical, undercutting the threat she represents. Even when she's unmasked, there's no Cruciatus Curse, no Avada Kedavra, no attempt at the mind control magic her mother delighted in. Instead, she ties up two teenagers and lectures them about destiny. This is particularly jarring because Voldemort's own magical arsenal was truly nightmarish. He killed with a flick of his wand and famously manipulated life and death itself by creating horcruxes. Bellatrix, his most fanatical follower, was legendary for her cruelty and mastery of the dark arts. When Neville Longbottom tells Harry, in Order of the Phoenix, that Bellatrix tortured his parents into madness, it is an enduring testament to her savagery and magical prowess. Bellatrix taunted Harry at the Department of Mysteries, relishing the use of the Cruciatus curse. By contrast, Delphi's plan hinges on stealing a time turner from two boys who barely passed Hogwarts exams. For all her lineage, she uses trickery and the element of surprise rather than powerful, unmistakably dark magic. Consider Delphi's grand plan. She wants to rewrite history by ensuring Voldemort's victory at the Battle of Hogwarts. She aims to use the time turner to travel back and send him a message. This is an ambitious idea, but her execution feels embarrassingly narrow in scope. She doesn't resurrect any of her father's old followers. She doesn't terrorize the wizarding world with fear and violence to distract Harry Potter or the Ministry. She doesn't even attempt to kill anyone until she's backed into a corner. For the supposed scion of the two deadliest dark wizards of the era, Delphi operates like a con artist with a single scheme, not a dark messiah ready to claim her throne. Her plan is not forged in blood and fear like Voldemort's reign of terror. It's built on fragile deceit and hope that no one notices her. Even when cornered, Delphi's options are weirdly tame. During the climactic confrontation at Godric's Hollow, she doesn't unleash unleash Fiendfire, or produce cursed objects. She fights a handful of wizards, and she loses. She is eventually restrained by a binding spell cast by Harry disguised as Voldemort himself, a moment that exposes the limits of her magic as well as her psychology. The woman who claimed to be her father's legacy crumbles at the sight of him, even if it's just polyjuice. "I only wanted to meet him," she sobs. This isn't the cold, calculating terror of Voldemort or Bellatrix. It's a broken, confused orphan with no plan. The contrast with her mother is particularly sharp. Bellatrix was depicted in the books as cunning and vicious, even without Voldemort's direct guidance. In Half-Blood Prince, she tries to recruit Narcissa to the cause and lectures Snape about loyalty to the Dark Lord. She's the one who gleefully suggests torturing Hermione in Deathly Hallows, and she nearly kills Ginny in the Battle of Hogwarts. Bellatrix didn't need permission to be sadistic. Delphi, on the other hand, seems to rely on the legend of her parents for intimidation, but never internalizes their methods. There is no scene where she relishes cruelty, no suggestion she has experimented with forbidden magics in the years since their deaths. Moreover, Voldemort himself was famously creative with dark magic. He created horcruxes to achieve immortality, cast spells no one else dared try, and routinely cursed items to devastating effect, like the opal necklace and the poisoned mead that nearly killed Katie Bell and Ron Weasley respectively. His murder of Bertha Jorkins to create a horcrux is a testament to his cruelty and magical inventiveness. Delphi, with access to this legacy, doesn't even seem aware such possibilities exist. If she truly had access to her father's research or followers, wouldn't she at least attempt to recreate a horcrux or bind her soul in some other way? Instead, she focuses on a single, stolen time-turner like a petty thief with no understanding of her own heritage. We should remember that Delphi is described as older than Albus and Scorpius, presumably an adult, yet she acts like a reckless teen whose entire strategy is manipulation and bluff. She recruits them to her cause by playing the lost sympathetic friend, but when the deception is revealed, there's no backup plan worthy of Voldemort. She has no army, no safe house full of cursed artifacts, no loyal followers who will die for her. Her entire campaign is one fragile, quickly unraveling plot. The girl who claims to be the Dark Lord's daughter has no real grasp of what made her father so terrifying, the ability to inspire loyal terror and wield lethal force with ease. It's also telling that in Cursed Child she never once uses the killing curse. This is an unforgivable omission for the child of Voldemort. The killing curse was his signature spell, something he used without hesitation, even on Muggles, as when he murdered Frank Bryce in Goblet of Fire. Bellatrix was also unafraid of lethal force, as seen when she kills Sirius Black. Delphi doesn't even attempt it. There is no scene in the play where she corners Harry, Ginny, Draco, or even the boys and raises her wand with those two fateful words, Avada Kedavra. For someone supposedly raised to finish Voldemort's mission, she is weirdly squeamish about the single most defining curse in her father's repertoire. One could argue that Delphi's true power lies in manipulation and deception, but even there the writing betrays her hype. She fools Albus and Scorpius for a time, sure, but these are Hogwarts students prone to breaking rules and disobeying authority. They're not the Auror Office or the Order of the Phoenix. Delphi never matches the cunning of her father's years-long infiltration of the Ministry via Pius Thicknesser or Barty Crouch Jr., disguised as Mad-Eye Moody. Voldemort's schemes were layered and insidious, turning trusted allies into threats. Delphi's entire plan hinges on a single con and fails the moment anyone pays close attention. Even the Time Turner itself represents a curious limitation. Rather than inventing new magical approaches to bring her father back, she relies on a relic with limited charges. She becomes desperate once its use is run out, reduced to threats and pleading. When she finally battles Harry, Ginny, Draco, and the kids, she is outnumbered but also outclassed. She has no powerful dark magic that can turn the tide, no lethal surprise up her sleeve. She is reduced to being overpowered and restrained like any common criminal. For a woman who claims to be the child of wizarding terror incarnate, she is shockingly easy to subdue. A telling moment comes when Harry, disguised as Voldemort, confronts her. She breaks. The fear in her is genuine, almost childlike. She whimpers that she only wanted to meet him, not rule with him. That single scene obliterates any pretense that Delphi was meant to be the Dark Lord's true heir. Instead, she's revealed as someone who worshipped the myth without understanding the man. Voldemort would have scorned such weakness. He murdered Snape in cold blood, tortured countless victims for information, and forced others to do his bidding through fear. Delphi cries and gives up when faced with an illusion of her father's power. In the end, Delphi's most threatening moment is arguably when she takes Albus hostage on the roof of St. Oswald's, but even then, it's an awkward bluff that depends on Scorpius's panic. There is no grand display of the dark arts, no invocation of blood magic, no wave of terror that brings the wizarding world to its knees. Harry and Draco fought Death Eaters who conjured fiend fire, used unforgivable curses without remorse, and tortured captives. Delphi never even hints at that level of skill or ruthlessness. Her entire character feels like the promise of darkness without the practice. Ultimately, Delphi is the daughter of two of the most dangerous dark wizards the world has ever known, yet she cannot match even their lieutenants in skill or cruelty. She doesn't replicate Voldemort's mastery of curses, Bellatrix's savage glee in torture, or even the organizational cunning of a Lucius Malfoy. The text wants us to believe she's a threat, but every choice she makes diminishes her menace. The idea of Voldemort's daughter should have been chilling, a witch raised on blood rituals and forbidden magic. Instead, we get someone who can't even bring herself to use the signature curses of her family. It's as if the script wanted the image of the dark heir without the dark magic that would make her truly frightening. Number 24. Why didn't Aurors find her? Many fans have puzzled over the tangled question of how Delphi, the alleged daughter of Lord Voldemort, managed to live and maneuver in wizarding Britain for so many years without attracting the attention of the Ministry of Magic or the Auror Office. After all, the books established clearly that the Ministry underwent sweeping reforms under the leadership of Hermione Granger, who had personally fought in the Battle of Hogwarts and witnessed how hidden Death Eaters and their networks continued to poison society even after Voldemort's defeat. When Hermione became minister, she implemented extensive measures to track former Death Eaters, to investigate known associates, and to identify any surviving family members who might attempt to restore Voldemort's legacy. It is therefore remarkable that Delphi, who was hardly anonymous, living openly in Britain and connected to known figures, could escape the net so thoroughly. The existence of such an heir should have been among the ministry's highest priorities, to confirm or debunk. Kingsley Shacklebolt, who served as interim minister before Hermione, had already authorized the Aurors to compile exhaustive registries of every Death Eater's relatives, dependents, and close companions. Names like Bellatrix Lestrange and Rodolphus Lestrange were at the top of every list. According to The Cursed Child, Delphi claimed she was born to Bellatrix before the Battle of Hogwarts. If that were true, the birth would almost certainly have been noticed by house elves at Malfoy Manor, where Bellatrix spent much of her time during Voldemort's final campaign. The Malfoys were under scrutiny after the war, their property searched, and their house elf questioned. Yet there is no canonical mention that anyone discovered a child's presence or even heard rumors of Bellatrix being pregnant, which is an implausible omission in the context of the ministry's vigilance. Some supporters of Delphi's story point to Euphemia Rawle, who allegedly raised the girl in secrecy, as the critical reason she remained hidden. Euphemia, however, came from the Rawle family, a name deeply entangled with Death Eater sympathies. Thorfinn Rawle fought at Hogwarts and was imprisoned after the war. When Euphemia took in Delphi, she would already have been flagged as a person of interest to the Aurors. If the ministry genuinely kept records on households with ties to Death Eaters, any sudden arrival of an unexplained child in Euphemia's care should have generated scrutiny, if not a direct investigation. The Aura Office had both magical and bureaucratic means to detect such anomalies. Harry Potter himself was an Aura by this point, and had spent years devoted to rooting out any lingering cells of Voldemort's followers. The idea that neither Harry nor any other Aura would have questioned Euphemia's guardianship strains credibility. The ministry under Hermione also invested heavily in modernizing intelligence-gathering methods. Goblins in Gringotts had been compelled to disclose financial transactions linked to known Death Eaters and their affiliates on the grounds that those funds might bankroll new, dark plots. A child raised in the wizarding world would likely need clothing, supplies, wands, or tuition, all of which cost money. Even if Euphemia avoided Hogwarts for Delphi, it remains difficult to believe no record at all was created in any magical ledger, particularly when the ministry had access to Gringotts records. This leads to the unsettling possibility that either Delphi somehow evaded all such transactions through extraordinary measures, or the ministry's much-touted reforms were less effective than described in canon. There are further complications in Delphi's own activities. She did not live like a recluse. She presented herself as Amos Diggory's niece and served as a caretaker in a recognized wizarding household. Amos Diggory, the grieving father of Cedric Diggory, was a public figure known to have once appealed to Harry Potter for support in memorializing his son. That Delphi could attach herself to Amos without any official verifying her identity or guardianship status is another lapse in basic oversight. According to The Cursed Child, Delphi claimed her father was Lucius Malfoy's close ally, a fact that should have raised red flags immediately. In the wizarding world, ancestry is a serious matter. Ministry clerks are accustomed to verifying lineage claims, and any mention of a Lestrange relation ought to have triggered a check against the files the Aurors had compiled after Voldemort's fall. Moreover, it is worth recalling that the ministry maintained registries of known magical births. Even during Voldemort's regime, some records were kept, albeit under duress. After the war, the ministry would have undertaken an audit of any suspicious omissions or late registrations. In this climate of rigorous cataloguing, Delphi's birth would have stood out. Either it was concealed magically, requiring powerful enchantments from Bellatrix and her allies, or the ministry's registries were hopelessly incomplete. This is not the atmosphere suggested by J.K. Rowling's epilogue, in which the wizarding world is healing, secure, and governed by watchful reformers. Adding to the implausibility is the fact that Delphi never adopted a false name. She called herself Delphine, a name unfamiliar to wizarding society but derived from the Latin for dolphin, which seems an odd choice for someone hoping to blend in. She did not operate on a different continent or in a remote enclave. She lived among British wizards, attended events, and cultivated acquaintances, all while pursuing the ultimate goal of resurrecting her father's cause. Even if her day-to-day behavior appeared harmless, the auras had been trained to look for precisely such covert networks. The notion that none of the surveillance charms, informant tips, or background checks ever revealed her existence challenges the premise that the Aura Office had truly learned the lessons of the war. In The Cursed Child, Delphi demonstrated advanced magical ability, including powerful dueling skills and occlumency. Such proficiency usually requires mentorship and practice. Who taught her? If she trained herself, she would still have needed books, wands, and an environment to rehearse spells without exposure. If someone trained her, that person would be complicit in a conspiracy of enormous scale. This hidden infrastructure cannot plausibly remain invisible to a ministry that successfully prosecuted countless Death Eaters and confiscated their resources. The text never offers a persuasive explanation for how she built this skill set undetected. A related inconsistency emerges when we consider Hermione's character. Hermione Granger, the same witch who once devised a meticulous plan to infiltrate the Ministry under Voldemort's control, would surely have designed robust measures to prevent another uprising. She was not naive about the possibility that children of Death Eaters could attempt to avenge their parents. The idea that she would not have instructed the Department of Magical Law Enforcement to follow up on any rumor of Voldemort's progeny contradicts her established caution and determination to protect Wizarding Britain. The story also neglects the role of Severus Snape's legacy. Though Snape died in the Battle of Hogwarts, he left behind extensive knowledge of Voldemort's inner circle and their movements. It is implausible that no one in the Ministry examined his memories for evidence of Bellatrix's final months. Snape's memories were instrumental in defeating Voldemort. It stands to reason they would have been combed for every detail that could help secure the peace. If Bellatrix was pregnant, Snape's observation or suspicion ought to have surfaced during these debriefings. There is an eerie absence of reaction from the wizarding public as well. In a world where gossip travels swiftly and Rita Skeeter's brand of investigative journalism can dig up personal histories, it defies logic that no one ever whispered about Bellatrix's rumoured child. Even if Euphemia Rolls secluded Delphi, a single slip, a letter intercepted by the Ministry, a sighting reported by a neighbour, a chance encounter with an aura, could have exposed her. Yet, The Cursed Child offers no such account. The silence becomes more conspicuous the more one examines it. The narrative tension relies on the shock value of Voldemort having left an heir, but it does so by erasing the enormous bureaucratic apparatus and the vigilance that canon insisted Hermione and Harry had painstakingly established. Readers who followed every procedural safeguard in the original 7 books, including the scrutiny of the trace, the registry of wands, and the enforcement of the Statute of Secrecy, cannot help but notice this vacuum of consequence. The Aura Office that once deployed entire squads to track a single Death Eater suddenly becomes incapable of investigating a child raised in the very heart of their jurisdiction. This paradox undermines not only the plausibility of Delphi's survival, but also the thematic message that vigilance and reform can overcome the shadows of the past. Without a credible explanation for her anonymity, the story feels less like a continuation of canon and more like a contrivance designed to resurrect Voldemort's terror without respecting the painstaking vigilance that followed his defeat. In that sense, the tale of Delphi exposes a gap in narrative logic that the books themselves had never tolerated. Number 25. Why didn't she try to have heirs? Delphi's entire arc in Harry Potter and the Cursed Child rests upon a fragile idea of destiny, an obsession with restoring Lord Voldemort's rule. Yet the story refuses to grant her the depth of planning one might expect from the Dark Lord's child. In the play, she appears with a single objective: to bring her father back and fulfill what she claims is his true legacy. But it is precisely here that the narrative fractures under close inspection. Her plan is terminal, desperate, bound entirely to the resurrection of her father's power, rather than any notion of a sustainable lineage. The woman who called herself the Augury, the prophesied harbinger of Voldemort's return, fails to consider what any true believer in bloodlines and destiny should: her own descendants. It is this baffling omission that makes her motivation seem paper-thin, an enemy drawn in broad strokes without the chilling cunning that her heritage might imply. In Cursed Child, Delphi's identity as Voldemort's daughter is presented as her entire justification for existing. When she proclaims, "I am the daughter of Lord Voldemort," it is less a family truth than a battle standard. But if she truly saw herself as the key to restoring his rule, why didn't she plan to carry his bloodline forward? The very idea of pure blood supremacy and magical dynasties is rooted in generational thinking. Bellatrix Lestrange, her mother, was part of the Black family, a house obsessed with lineage. It is entirely out of character for Delphi, raised with this cultish reverence for Voldemort's memory, not to see her own womb as a potential crucible for the Dark Lord's continued legacy. Her apparent lack of interest in securing heirs contradicts the fundamental logic of blood purist ideology. Voldemort himself, for all his fear of death, invested in a grotesque form of immortality through horcruxes, fragmenting his soul to ensure he would not be forgotten. He was obsessed with legacy in the most twisted of ways. He did not care for children in the normal sense, but he cared deeply for the perpetuation of his power and name. Delphi, on the other hand, seems to possess none of that foresight. Her plan is comically suicidal: to alter time, gamble on victory, and accept annihilation if she fails. Even as she speaks of fulfilling the prophecy, she has no backup plan, no idea of what happens next. If she had been written with any true sense of ambition, it would be obvious that she might consider continuing the line in a literal, biological fashion, an idea far simpler and more natural than time travel. There is a moment when Delphi's fanatical belief in the prophecy feels eerily hollow. She stalks Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy through time, determined to resurrect a world where Voldemort wins. But for all her menace, she never once hints at plans to build something lasting. This is particularly jarring given that her entire motivation is built on blood, her father's blood, her own blood. A woman so devoted to the purity and power of her lineage would logically be obsessed with its survival. In the wizarding world, where family lines like the Malfoys and Blacks obsessively preserve heritage, Delphi stands out as bafflingly short-sighted, caring only about a single moment of triumph rather than the centuries that could follow. Consider the Death Eaters themselves. Lucius Malfoy maneuvered constantly to protect Draco. Even Bellatrix, for all her cruelty, stayed within the sacred traditions of her family. These characters valued the continuation of their bloodlines to absurd degrees. Voldemort himself, though scornful of normal human love or family, accepted this mentality enough to use those families for power, manipulation, and loyalty. Delphi, supposedly raised with the legends of her father's greatness, never seems to understand that building power requires more than violence. There is no suggestion she would recruit followers, found a new generation of Death Eaters or birth children who could one day take up her mission. The play fails to give her a single line that suggests she ever thought about the future past Voldemort's resurrection. When Harry Potter confronts her at St. Oswald's home for old witches and wizards, she cries that she only wants to see her father. It's an emotional moment designed to make her pathetic rather than terrifying, but it also limits her. She becomes a fanatic with no strategy. This lack of vision is what makes her seem so thinly drawn compared to the villains of the original books, who, even at their most unhinged, understood the value of planting seeds for the future. Voldemort was nothing if not strategic, manipulating the Ministry, the Hogwarts staff, and even the magical creatures of Britain to ensure he had allies when needed. Delphi seems content to die as long as she gets to meet her father once, which is less a dark legacy than a self-destructive delusion. The most glaring irony is that Voldemort's own plan for immortality, horcruxes, was precisely a plan for a kind of inheritance. He fractured his soul so that his name, his power, and his influence would never die. Delphi claims to worship this man, to want to bring about his triumph, yet she cannot grasp even that twisted lesson. If she truly admired her father's cunning, wouldn't she consider creating her own horcrux, even in the form of a child? A child who could continue her mission if she failed. Instead, she is written like a one-note zealot whose entire strategy collapses the moment time travel fails. There is also the matter of magical tradition. In the Harry Potter universe, powerful witches and wizards are often preoccupied with heritage. The Sacred 28, pure-blood families obsessed with pedigree, showed the extent of this obsession. Even half-bloods like Snape were marked by the tensions between magical and Muggle ancestry. That Delphi, supposedly indoctrinated with Voldemort's vision, would ignore this entirely feels like a betrayal of the setting's internal logic. She might have seduced a devoted follower, arranged a marriage for strategic gain, or even forcibly ensured her line continued. These are dark, chilling paths consistent with the wizarding world's traditions of power and blood. It's worth noting that Rowling's original books never shied away from showing the cold-blooded calculations of her villains. "There is nothing worse than death, Dumbledore," Voldemort screams in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. His fear of mortality defines him. Delphi has no such fear, no plan for her own survival or the survival of her ideals. She has no strategy to avoid death or ensure victory by other means. This is why her character feels so hastily sketched. She isn't a second Voldemort. She's a poor imitation without the intelligence that made the original terrifying. One might argue Delphi is meant to be a tragedy, a child doomed to fail because she misunderstands her father's true nature. But even tragedy requires logic. It would be far more compelling if she were obsessed with the idea of restoring a bloodline, if she failed not because she didn't think of heirs, but because she couldn't have them, or because her followers betrayed her. Instead, the play never even raises the question. The result is a villain who seems to lack any sense of scale, who fails to see past the immediate moment. This is not the mark of a true heir to Voldemort's legacy, but of a shallow antagonist written for shock value. The tragedy of Delphi could have been rooted in legacy denied. Imagine if she had plotted to create her own dynasty only to fail because no one would follow her, or because magical infertility cursed her bloodline as punishment for her father's sins. That would have carried emotional weight. But as it stands, she is presented as if such ideas never occurred to her. The script robs her of depth by refusing to explore the question of what happens after Voldemort returns. Is she his queen, his general, his successor, or simply a disposable zealot who never thinks about the world they would create? The lack of any answer makes her entire mission seem childish. Even within Cursed Child's own logic, time travel is an unreliable, doomed strategy. Albus and Scorpius repeatedly demonstrate how dangerous it is, with catastrophic alternate timelines unfolding from small changes. Delphi is intelligent enough to orchestrate polyjuice disguises, research prophecies, and trace time-turners, yet she never considers that her plan might fail. If she were truly Voldemort's daughter, wouldn't she hedge her bets, create loyal followers, have children, establish contingency plans? Voldemort himself moved like a chess master, always with layers of protection and fallback schemes. Delphi's failure to think beyond the single plan feels insulting to the reader's intelligence. It suggests that the writers never considered her humanity. Even monstrous people have goals beyond the moment. Even fanatics think about what happens if they succeed. Her complete lack of interest in building a future reveals her as a prop for the plot, not a character with motivations that make sense. This is the real betrayal of her legacy as Voldemort's child. She is not frightening because she has no true vision. She is not tragic because she never even tries to build something that could be lost. When Albus and Scorpius confront her in Godric's Hollow, she is portrayed as unhinged, a dark priestess willing to sacrifice everything for prophecy. But in the world Rowling created, sacrifice is never meaningless. The Death Eaters risked their lives for Voldemort because they believed he would reward them with power, with safety for their families. Delphi's plan offers nothing to anyone, not even herself. This emptiness is never examined in the play. No one ever asks, what would she have done after Voldemort returned? How would she rule? How would she ensure his vision endured? These questions could have made her compelling. Instead, she is left as a one-dimensional monster who wants to break the world for no reason but her own yearning for a father's love. That single-minded hunger is not uninteresting in itself. It could have been written with tragic power. A woman determined to prove herself to a father who never knew her is a potent idea. But the text does nothing with it. Instead, Delphi is given a single note to play, and that note is shrill and unsatisfying. There is no suggestion she might have feared dying childless, that she saw her own body as an instrument of destiny, the way Voldemort saw his soul. In a world so obsessed with ancestry, it is an astonishing omission. The audience is left wondering whether the writers forgot the basic rules of their own universe. Ultimately, Delphi's failure to consider her own legacy is what makes her feel like a clumsy afterthought rather than a true extension of Voldemort's evil. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who understood power, who built networks of loyalty, who planned for the future in the darkest possible ways. Delphi is none of that. She is not even his spiritual heir. She is a vessel for cheap drama without the terrifying plausibility that made the original villains so haunting. In the end, the question remains unanswered. Why didn't she plan to continue his line? The silence of the text on this point is deafening. Number 26. Why didn't Voldemort kill the child at birth? In the secretive corridors of the wizarding world, few figures inspired as much dread and speculation as Lord Voldemort. His every decision was fueled by an obsession with power and a pathological mistrust of anyone who might threaten his supremacy. The notion that he fathered a daughter, Delphi, who would one day attempt to resurrect him, defies the very pattern of behavior he demonstrated throughout his rise and fall. The books, especially Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, gave countless examples of Voldemort's unflinching readiness to annihilate any potential rival, no matter how insignificant they might seem. It was Voldemort himself who declared, "There is no good and evil, there is only power, and those too weak to seek it." This singular fixation on power makes it almost impossible to reconcile that he would allow an infant to exist who could, however remotely, pose a threat to his legacy. It is worth recalling the cold deliberation with which Voldemort selected the objects that would become horcruxes. He chose items of profound historical value. The diary of Tom Riddle, Helga Hufflepuff's cup, Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, because he believed no one would suspect them and no one could track them all. The same meticulous paranoia guided his approach to allies. Even his most devoted servants, such as Bellatrix Lestrange, never truly earned his trust. He demanded unwavering loyalty but withheld genuine closeness because attachment was, in his eyes, a corrosive liability. So the idea that he would permit Bellatrix to carry his child to term, knowing it would inevitably create a living link to him, feels not only inconsistent but fundamentally absurd. One can look to the example of Severus Snape to illustrate Voldemort's calculating nature. Snape's entire survival hinged on the utility he provided, and even then, Voldemort only tolerated him because he believed Snape's knowledge of Dumbledore and the Order of the Phoenix was indispensable. Yet the moment Snape's usefulness appeared exhausted, Voldemort murdered him without hesitation, as described in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. If he could discard a skilled wizard who had risked everything to serve him, why would he make an exception for an infant whose only significance was her genetic connection to his bloodline? There is also the matter of Voldemort's hatred of weakness. He was raised unloved in the orphanage and emerged from that childhood convinced that any trace of attachment was a mark of inferiority. When he spoke to Dumbledore in the memory from Half-Blood Prince, he sneered at the idea of caring for family or friends. He said, I knew I was different, I knew I was special. There is nothing more important than realizing your own greatness. Such a man would never have seen a child as a precious continuation of himself. He would have regarded Delphi as a vulnerability to be eliminated before it ever endangered him. Even Bellatrix Lestrange herself, a woman whose fanatical devotion bordered on worship, was not immune to Voldemort's coldness. In the climactic battle of Hogwarts, she fought beside him not because he valued her life, but because she was yet another instrument in his arsenal. Her death at the hands of Molly Weasley was met with no reaction from Voldemort, proof that sentimentality never intruded on his ambitions. The concept that he would trust Bellatrix enough to bear his child and keep that child hidden stretches credibility past breaking. If he knew about Delphi, why would he not have eradicated this latent threat in the precise manner he dealt with any other perceived liability? Voldemort's own conduct during the hunt for the prophecy in Order of the Phoenix reveals his merciless practicality. The prophecy itself posed a hypothetical danger. He did not rest until he had launched an assault on the Department of Mysteries to seize it personally, risking exposure and open conflict with the Ministry of Magic. If he would go to such lengths over words spoken in a darkened room, how could he have ignored a living descendant who might one day claim his mantle or reveal the secret of her birth? One might argue that perhaps Voldemort did not know Delphi existed, but even this explanation conflicts with his obsession with control. He scrutinized every alliance and every plan. Bellatrix was not a woman to conceal pregnancy without consequence. As described in The Cursed Child, Delphi's existence was an open secret among certain factions of the remaining Death Eaters. For Voldemort not to have discovered it implies a level of ignorance that contradicts the vigilance he maintained over all his followers. He who could smell treachery in the slightest hesitation or faintest expression was unlikely to overlook the prolonged absence or suspicious behavior of his most ardent disciple. The philosophy Voldemort espoused was also brutally simple. Anything that did not contribute to his power deserved to be destroyed. When he first confronted the infant Harry Potter, he did not hesitate to cast the killing curse. The child had not yet become a rival, but Voldemort's instinct was annihilation, not restraint. That same impulse should have applied to Delphi. She represented nothing but risk, an unpredictable future, an uncontrollable variable. It is difficult to accept that a man who killed for far less would have allowed her the chance to live. Even the prophecy that haunted Voldemort underscored his pathological dread of potential rivals. He had every reason to believe that Neville Longbottom could have been the chosen one, yet he targeted the Potters first simply because he thought Harry posed the greater threat. This instinct to preemptively eliminate any possibility of challenge shows the extent of his paranoia. He would never have gambled on a child's harmlessness or trusted that the daughter of Bellatrix would remain loyal to his cause after his death. In Goblet of Fire, Voldemort returned to life through a ritual that required the bone of his father, the flesh of a servant, and the blood of an enemy. He had no qualms about desecrating his own family's remains to further his goals. The man who ordered the murder of Bertha Jorkins merely because she had overheard fragments of his plans could hardly be expected to spare a child whose mere existence represented the chance, however remote, of a successor he had not chosen. Bellatrix's devotion was undoubtedly genuine, but Voldemort had no capacity to return it. He did not understand love, nor did he respect it. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore tells Harry that Voldemort never comprehended the protective power of Lily Potter's sacrifice because he could not fathom selfless affection. If he failed to recognize the strength of love, he would not have granted Delphi mercy out of sentiment. His actions elsewhere prove that he considered family a liability, not a legacy. The lack of logic in this plotline becomes starker when one recalls Voldemort's consistent disdain for anything resembling ordinary humanity. He thought himself superior to every wizard and witch, dismissing their bonds as trifles. His philosophy was that only immortality and conquest mattered. The idea that he would leave behind a child, for any reason, practical or emotional, contradicts every known aspect of his personality. He would have disposed of Delphi without remorse, just as he disposed of countless others.